Hey friends, this is Robb, and I thought I'd just capture a few minutes of chatting about Bitcoin. For those of you who said you're interested, there's obviously a lot of great stuff online about Bitcoin, and you can read more about it. This is just my perspective on it. I've known about Bitcoin for years. Probably, I could have been investing in Bitcoin all along. I could have bought a lot more even 6-7 years ago. I didn't. Obviously, that turned out to be a stupid decision. But to some degree, the reason I didn't, and the reason I'm acknowledging this, is that I was interested to see the network effect of Bitcoin build before I did, and that really is the core, I think, discussion to have around Bitcoin, is the sense that any store of value, anything that's valuable out in the world, operates on a network effect. Meaning, gold would not be valuable if only one or two people in the whole world thought gold was valuable. By definition, something that acts as a store of value does so because a lot of people think it's valuable. And the more people think something is valuable, the more of a network effect it has, the more it can act as a store of value, because then it becomes more and more liquid in the sense that people will exchange you other things of value for it. So, they'll give you dollars for your gold, or your gold can be traded for cars or food or housing or what have you. So by definition, things of value have to have a network effect associated with them. And cryptocurrencies, when they came along, no one had ever really seen something like this. And so the question of whether it got adopted and whether people believed in it was very much an open question. Now, that has largely been settled, at least this past decade. In successive waves of run-ups from 0 to 1,000 to 4,000 to 20,000 to now $40,000 per coin, Bitcoin has proven to be very robust, as millions of people have gotten involved or bought Bitcoin, and billions, first millions of dollars and then billions of dollars, and now approaching $1 trillion of total real money having flowed into the network. And so ultimately the network effect that underlies Bitcoin is really proven to be quite robust, and it doesn't really show any signs of slowing down. And as you've seen on my Twitter feed, I've said that there's very few things that we see as clean and pure of an experiment in the lower left as what you see with something like Bitcoin, because it really is a pure experiment in the lower left, meaning that network effect that's occurring is a matter of belief. Now, in a sec we'll kind of unpack what some of those beliefs are and why that's occurring, but you can't deny the fact that the reason the dollar value continues to grow is because people are adopting it. And that's happening because of a growing collective belief that undergirds it. So it's a pretty interesting phenomena just from that standpoint. And obviously the value, has continued to grow. Now, talking about that value for a minute, one of the things I pointed out is that there is no intrinsic value to Bitcoin one way or another. If $1 trillion flows into Bitcoin, then you can take the number of coins on the network and divide it by the $1 trillion of capital that have gone into it, and you're going to get, a set of prices that reflect that. If that number was only 10% of that, well, then you're going to have prices that reflect that. Neither is better or worse per se. One might have a more robust network effect by virtue of the fact that more people have adopted it. But there's really no intrinsic value to it per se as it relates to the dollar amount, other than the fact that more capital going in means that there's more value per coin. And really the key innovation of Bitcoin in a lot of ways is the fact that it's got a fixed supply on a digital ledger, a public database. So that fixed supply is really very powerful. So we're at about 18.5 million coins having been mined today, and a total upper limit, mathematically, a total upper limit on the coinage of about 21 million, actually 21 million exactly. And that's significant, right? Because if, let's say, you have $1 trillion or approaching $1 trillion in capital that has gone into the network today, and you're at, 90% of the Bitcoin that will ever be in existence has already been mined, that tells you that over the next 10 years, as we increasingly approach 20 and then 21 trillion, that's it. That's all the supply that will ever be available. And if the value or the amount of money that goes into the network goes from 1 trillion to 2 trillion to 4 trillion to 8 trillion, well, then the value of the coins, by definition, will have to go up a whole hell of a lot. So a $30,000 or $40,000 coin today could very easily see 80,000 within a couple years. Could see 200,000 within a few years after that. Could see 500,000 after that. And you might say, what's the upper limit? Well, it's kind of a weird question, because at the end of the day, remember that when we talk about what the other side of that Bitcoin measurement is, it's dollars, right? And so, this is a little nuanced, but I think you'll track it, right? So if we're talking about $1 trillion in today, and what's the instance where it goes to 5 trillion or 10 trillion? Well, it's with economic growth and more money printing, right? And so one of the things that are drawing people into Bitcoin is the fact that the other currency, the thing that's measured in, at least dollars, is being printed by the Federal Reserve at a massive rate. I mean, they're inflating the value of your money away. At least that's the argument that a lot of Bitcoiners would make, and it's clearly that is true. So if they continue to print money the way they have in the standard fiat-based economic system, then you can understand why more and more money supply being out there, more and more quote-unquote economic growth being driven through money printing, more inflation, probably more debt-driven growth, and you have an overall economy that grows. At least it looks like it grows on paper, right? But if the economy grows by 6%, most of which was on borrowed money, and much of that was generated out of thin air from the Fed printing dollars, and therefore a 5% inflation rate, well, then that's not real economic growth. But that's 6% of economic growth. If it translates into more money being in the economy, and therefore capitalization of Bitcoin goes from $1 trillion to 2 trillion to 4 trillion to 8 trillion, well, then you can see how the value of Bitcoin could grow in real terms, even though the overall economy was growing kind of in fake terms. I know that's maybe a little bit hard to catch, but it's actually quite important to the overall case of whether you might be interested in Bitcoin. The fundamental notion is that Bitcoin has a relatively fixed supply over the next 10 or 15 year time horizon. And the supply of dollars that they're going to try to use to drive economic growth is fairly limitless. And so in a way, Bitcoin is a bet on that arbitrage. It's a bet on that sort of disequilibrium between those two things. And you might say, well, why are they going to have to print the dollars? Well, ultimately, it's because they're facing a deflationary economy globally. We're in a deflationary period, not an inflationary one. We have a demographic problem, and technology itself is fundamentally deflationary, which means it drives down prices. We get more for our money through technology every day and every year. And some of the innovations coming along over the next 10 or 15 years are going to be absolutely extraordinarily in terms of their potential for deflation. following, not just Moore's law, but other kinds of power laws in terms of how information becomes more and more inexpensive. Another way to think about it is the more that our economic life is at the later stages of the evolutionary stack, meaning it's not in oil or cars or housing per se. It's more in Netflix, information goods, media we consume, web services, and other things that are kind of in the information domain. The more subject to deflationary economics we will be. Now, the reason this is a serious problem, of course, is that we have a whole bunch of promises to an entire generation in the form of the baby boomers in terms of their pensions and other retirement assets. So the broader way to see this, in a sense, is that the politicians have made a huge set of promises to the voting class, who are active voters, right? These are our boomers. They're active voters. They're very politically influential, our most politically influential generation and socioeconomic group. And they also hold all the assets, by the way. So they're not only the 1%, they really do hold most of the assets. And they're also the captains of industry and all this other stuff. So the point is, that is not a group that is going to get left out in the cold by the people who control the printing presses. They're going to make sure that the asset values stay up. They're going to make sure that whatever's needed to combat these deflationary forces, both in form of technology as well as demographics. We have a graying population, and relatively static overall population growth. And by the way, we also have people leaving the workforce. The boomers are leaving the workforce as they retire. And so all of those things mean you've got some serious headwinds on economic growth. And so you have all this debt sitting out there. You have slowing economic growth. You have deflationary technology. And all those things add up to a very ugly economic picture in terms of keeping the value of assets propped up, meaning stocks and bonds, real estate, etc. So how do you get out of this mess? Well, you print. You just flood the economy with money. And what that fundamentally does then is it turns you from an inflationary kind of economy to what they're going to attempt is inflation. All right? And that's why you're seeing inflation pop up in, goods and housing and healthcare and all these other things, because they've been running this playbook for well over a decade now, a couple of decades, frankly. And of course, it drives massive wealth inequality and all this other stuff. That kind of takes us too far afield for the moment, this discussion about Bitcoin. But the point is that at a macro level, that's the bet. I mean, that's the bet you're making with something like Bitcoin that says, okay, I want to put my money. Let's say you have $50,000 that you are trying to protect against inflation, and what these policymakers are going to continue to try to do over the next 10 years, and you want to put it into a store of value where the supply cannot be inflated because it's mathematically impossible for that to happen, well then, and it's anonymous, and it can be divided up, easily, and it can be sent relatively frictionlessly to anywhere in the world, et cetera, et cetera. So it's got all these characteristics of money in a store of value. They're very attractive, but fundamentally it's a bet against the inflationary forces of what the Western governments are going to do and what they have done. There's no reason to think that network effect has run its course. If anything, it seems to be picking up speed. As I said, it's approaching $1 trillion in terms of the whole crypto market, and it could very easily see that over the next 5 years go to multiples of that. Of the gold market, I think is roughly 6 to 7 trillion in terms of total market capitalization, and a lot of pundits would say that they would expect Bitcoin to at least get to to that spot, and I think that's probably a reasonable guesstimate. Which would put it, sometimes somewhere, close to an order of magnitude higher in terms of the overall value than it is today. So I think that's kind of the overall macro analysis. That's the what and the why of Bitcoin. I have been buying. It's a very volatile asset, clearly, or a very volatile store of value. So anything that can go up 400% in a month can also drop 50% in a week, and it does. And so you have to be prepared to either trade it actively, which I probably wouldn't recommend, or you just kind of slowly accumulate it when you can on the dips, and then you look at it with a long-term perspective. There will come a time where I suppose years out, you'd have to look at it and say, okay, is it still maintaining its thesis as a potentially strong store of value? And a lot of that, I think, comes down to some of the governmental responses. There are some people who obviously think a lot about this, and I think that they would argue that it's actually relatively safe, even from a full-on governmental assault. I'm not as convinced of that. I think that if history's proven anything, it's that the U.S. government is pretty strong and capable of taking the knees out of something if they want to. But it's as we said, it's not even a fraction of the gold market yet. One would think that it's probably not going to get too much attention until it gets to that point, even though obviously the feds are talking about regulations on it, and they're talking about a cryptocurrency directly from the Federal Reserve called FedCoin. So they're clearly keeping quite a close eye on it. But the other thing is that if you take your Bitcoin, you put it into cold storage, which means you offload it into a portable drive, portable wallet, and there are some ones that are specifically designed just to do that, which I would recommend you get. That's something that you can go with you. You could jump on a plane, and you've just taken your Bitcoin with you, and now you basically have your money with you, wherever you go in the world. And certainly there's people that like that feature of it too. They like the sovereignty of feeling like their at least some of their assets are portable, anonymous, and sovereign from government. Let's see what else to mention here. I think in terms of overall portfolio allocation, I think even a conservative allocation would probably be 1%. I think higher allocations of 3 to 5%, maybe even 10% in some cases is probably appropriate, depending on your risk posture. I have no problem, for example, in mine to be at 10%, because it's part of a diversified portfolio, and I also have a pretty deep belief that the overall thesis behind it is going to prove itself out. Someone asked me, I think in one of the tweet replies, how it corresponds to or interfaces with the Great Release. And I think it is really, truly core, actually, to the thesis of the Great Release, in the sense that the Great Release is very much being driven by the failure of the United States to more intelligently accommodate its own power, and particularly economic power, within its own borders, and of course without as well, internationally. And what I mean by that in particular is that it's engaged in a 4 or 5 decade process internally of increasing policies that have increasingly wiped out the middle class and consolidated the wealth amongst a few people in the country. And that's made it fundamentally irresilient. And now, as we just talked about, in order to accommodate that problem, what it's going to do is it's going to print even more. And so the the loss of American hegemony is going to come on the back of its real idiotic short-sightedness about how it has created these real problematic policies that create internal irresilience through massive wealth inequality, and the way it has used its position as the world's dominant reserve currency to basically finance that outcome, to use its position as the dollar issuer of dollars to be able to run massive deficits, to try to keep its political promises to its pension class, to try to keep its political promises in terms of health care, all these other things that have run up our fiscal deficit, while at the same time propping up financial assets for the 1%. And it's, of course, been a disaster for the country, and we're seeing that with the rise of populism, which always rises on the back of inflation. And we have had a real brutal hidden inflation for the last 20 years. If you look at the value of the dollar as measured in gold, which you can find on my Twitter account, it's ugly. I mean, the dollar's just been absolutely wiped out in terms of its purchasing power, which is why people can't afford houses and can't afford health care, and they can't afford, more and more things that are kind of core, a college education and these other things. And that's driving the populism. So the Great Release is a thesis about the breakdown of the U.S. for many reasons. There are certainly cultural elements to it, and there's political issues and all of that. But kind of at the core of it is the nature of imperial power, which really at the end of the day follow the money, and it is about the money and how we've mishandled that power from an economic point of view, and that will continue. And so the accommodation that is underway now is still short-sighted, it's still stupid, and it's going to make the problem deeper and worse, even while trying to perpetuate the game. So it is my belief that something like Bitcoin, and in fact Bitcoin, although it arguably could be a few other things, is going to be at the center of a move into the transformation age, where American hegemony breaks down on the loss of confidence in the U.S. dollar, because everybody can see what they're doing inside the country. Citizens will see that the Fed is killing the dollar, so they're going to be putting their money in stocks, as we've seen, putting their money in real estate, as we've seen, and putting their money in Bitcoin and gold and these other things, because they don't want to sit in the dollar. And then outside the country, our geopolitical opponents can see how we use the dollar as a diplomatic bludgeon to try to punish our competitors or opponents, and end up using it in ways that make them want us to lose hegemony as well. So the deck is not stacked well in favor of this lasting forever, and China and Russia and others, Iran, it's very much in their interest to basically facilitate anything that would cause the dollar to cease being the dominant reserve currency over time. And Bitcoin is, I think, what arises in its place to do that. Not just Bitcoin. Clearly gold and oil are big components in that picture. But yeah, so the rise of the Internet of Value, what's called the Internet of Value, meaning literally an internet work, which is what the internet is short for, the internetwork of value, meaning so the World Wide Web is an internet of information and an internet of media and an internet of websites that serve up information and media, whether it be text or what have you. Well, the Internet of Value is saying the same thing, just with a different object. And the object in this case is stored value. So the Internet of Value that I've said is going to be the sort of central currency of the transformation age at Teal, arising over the next 20 years with Teal, is just that. It's going to be some form of trustless, trans-statal, so beyond the nation, trans-nation statal distributed, so it's distributed and decentralized, internetwork of value storage. And, at that point, you just say, well, do we think it's Bitcoin, or could it be something else? Could it be a Bancor-like instrument that actually had the imprimatur of the nation states themselves to do that? In fact, this is one of the things I kind of argued a little bit should happen. If the United States was feeling real visionary and really wanted to step into a true leadership position in the transformation age, I think it would explore just that. It would explore a crypto ledger-based Bancor-like instrument that it would be a part of, but not be the dominant player, and it would be one of many players, and would allow it, by virtue of setting up the protocol, would allow it to sort of lead the world into the transformation age in a way that would really reestablish a sense of global leadership, but also prepare the world for an equitable form of economic competition in the 21st century. The way we're headed now is truly almost like a World War I regression of inflation, currency wars, tariff wars, and then hot shooting wars. And so the road we're on is not a good one, and but it may be asking too much for the political forces within the U.S. to be smart enough and strategic enough to see what's required here. And unfortunately, that is the nature of a great release, isn't it? Is that by definition, what a great release points to is the fact that the system's irresilient. It literally cannot respond to change because the overall system IQ has gotten stupid. Not just cognitively stupid, but the system itself can't even bring the right voices to power. It can't even bring the right incentives into the system. It can't even bring the right people and players to bear. And so what happens is it becomes kind of a free-for-all where it's kind of winner-take-all, and this becomes, read the news. This is where we are today. And it's extremely dysfunctional because the social holon in question, or the ecosystem in question, can't generate the system-level intelligence it needs to then adapt. And so what happens is it has to go through this breakdown. And only by going through a breakdown, only by going through what amounts to a real shit show, and that really then blows up the power mafia, the power connections, blows up the 1%, blows up all of the ways in which the system is stagnant and all of the accumulated resources have been hogged and are not flowing properly. All of those interconnections have to get blown up in order for it to go into the next phase, which is the reorganization phase. And that's when the innovation really, really explodes and really starts to come alive. And I might argue that at least in some spheres, that reorganization phase of the Great Release has already begun. In fact, it's quite appropriate to point out that Bitcoin, not surprisingly, arose out of the initiation of the Great Release of 2008. So when the Great Release started, at least by my measurement, my clock, was 2008, the great global financial crisis. And you end up then with this absolute implosion of the world financial system. No surprise that Bitcoin grows up literally right at that moment, right? At the end of 2008 is when Satoshi Nakamoto publishes the original, white paper and puts the software out there. And in the first block, famously, the first block of the blockchains points to an article on the banks getting bailed out, I think, in England. So this was already a moment where the very first seeds and the DNA of the reorganization kind of underway for the Great Release that was beginning. This sense that, okay, the world's economic system dominated by the U.S., with this ever-present playbook of the Federal Reserve printing money to bail out the political promises, to never let the economy adjust and go through any real pain, to never let the healthy forest fire occur, which would have cleared out the underbrush in the stagnant ecosystem that is the world system dominated by the U.S. and the economy. That just continues to not be allowed to happen. And so the whole system is getting more and more irresilient. More and more tinder is building up, and the ultimate fire is just going to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I would probably argue that reorganization phase already started in certain domains even back then, but really we're still at kind of at the broader level, we're still really in the release phase. The overall release phase is where we're at. The big breakdowns haven't occurred. I mean, Washington of last week is clearly an acute version of a great release. And I think in the political domain, it may in fact be the case that that's the beginning of the end, or the beginning of the most acute portion of the Great Release on the political domain. But obviously these things are going to occur in all four quadrants in lots of different domains and lines of overall socioevolutionary development, including, psychological development. And so the Great Release is going to take place in all these different areas, and there will be ways in which these different domains have reorganization phases underway variously at different paces and different ways. But I do think that the Internet of Value is what is arising to become then the standard of value exchange and store of value for our economic lives 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now. And it is, I think, a very reasonable and good bet to be a buyer of Bitcoin on the back of that bet. And that's how I think they're related to the Great Release. And so hopefully that's helpful to provide a little bit of unpacking. Let's see. I think I'll probably close here, just trying to think if there's anything else that's worth mentioning. As I said, there's a lot of really good thinkers, and people have dove into all these different areas. What happens when quantum computing comes up, and can the governments really shut it down, and how does it really stack up against other kinds of money? Is it a Ponzi scheme? The answer is no. I mean, at a broad level, it's not a Ponzi scheme on a narrow basis, and it's certainly not a Ponzi scheme on a broad basis, unless you think that all money is a Ponzi scheme, which is kind of what I pointed out on Twitter last week. All money, all stores of value are a Ponzi scheme in the sense that their value comes from the next person coming along saying, okay, I think that's valuable, and so I'm willing to buy it from you. I mean, that's true of gold. It's true of U.S. dollars. It's true of stocks. It's true of houses. It's true of everything. Anything where we're storing our economic life in it. And economic life, remember, is just stored energy, stored economic energy, stored past work, past innovation, past productivity, what have you. That's what a store of value has to do. So no, Bitcoin is not a Ponzi scheme. Could it eventually fail? I mean, I suppose anything that threatened the network effect in the lower left could ultimately lead to its long-term decline and eventual failure. Sure, and it's certainly possible that happens. And if that did, then so be it. But at this point, and one of the reasons I waited actually several years to watch to see whether the network effect caught legs, but that's at this point that's looking less and less likely by the month. So that's it. Hopefully I've helped you with this short piece on it, and I will catch up with you guys later. Okay, thanks. Bye.